Askreddit Asks, Immigrants from China, what was a piece of media you didn't know was censored until you left China?
I've posted about this before. I literally had no idea about Tiananmen Square massacre until I got here. Most people older than me saw the protests in the streets, but I never heard anyone talking about it. Ever.
I'm a second-gen immigrant but went back and grew up in China since very young. I never learned about this until when I went to study abroad. It's pretty shocking that this was never brought up during my entire childhood amongst my family either. I brought it up with my parents recently. Turns out my dad even protested during then. Crazy just how much this event became completely silenced.
I'm curious. How did you initially react to the information?
Moved to the States at 6 years old. Learned about Tiananmen in the US. Visited Beijing with family at 13-ish. We visited Tiananmen Square. I asked my mum in public, "Hey, wasn't this where the Tiananmen Square massacre happened?" My mum got scared and told me to never talk about this in public. Apparently there are undercover officers that walk around and would arrest us if they hear people talking about things like this. Didn't understand back then.
My parents are from China, Uyghur. Not Chinese. Mom told us that when the Korean Wars were happening, the CCP made her family donate their riches to help the cause in North Korea. It wasn't until they left China that they found out what a shithole North Korea was.
The part of Korea that is now North Korea was actually the industrial center of Korea before the war. Now, Korea was a poor nation before the war due to Japanese occupation. But it's crazy how things have flipped and the immense gap in prosperity between the North and South now.
I sincerely hope none of your family remain in Xinjiang now.
When I was on a high school trip like 5 years ago, we had a tour guide, such a nice and funny dude, who sat with a few OFME and my friends while we were on our way back from a long day at a zoo or something. Everyone in the bus was half asleep but we were chatting him up. Intrigued by everything we were learning. At one point he mentioned the Tiananmen massacre, and talked about it with such sadness in his voice. He said he was a student while it was happening, and he protested along with the rest of his classmates. But then they heard sirens and gunshots. And then he said he just ran. He didn't stay there long enough to witness much. But on his way out of the square he said he saw one of his classmates get run over by a tank that was headed straight for the square. He asked us to not mention anything about this story while we were still on that trip. It was so sad to see him afraid to speak about it. Edit. Thanks for my first ever award. Kind stranger.
Maybe this should have been tagged as serious. Maybe? Question mark. Question mark.
Maybe posts should default to serious. Because most people find facts and information more important than puns.
Well, we're waiting. Old guy. GIF winking face.
Obligatory not Chinese. But I lived in China for 3 years. I had Chinese HBO and was really happy to see many of my favorite movies come on when I was couch surfing. But half the time I'd watch them and, like, a day or two later I would be lying in bed trying to go to sleep and I'd remember a scene from that movie that didn't appear in the Chinese version. Apocalypto, much omitted. Ron Burgundy, much omitted. Thrones, much omitted. I wish I could remember which movie it was, but in one case an entire subplot was excised from the film. I got really angry about it. It pisses me off on an artistic level. I can't believe HBO and those who license the films to them let them compromise and devalue their art like that. There's not a lot here, so I'll write what I've experienced in China about Taiwan. At first they insisted it was entirely part of the PROC. Then when I asked about if they can go to visit, it was described as a place full of rebels with guns who'd shoot at them if they tried. This was in Fuzhou, which is only about 100 kilometers from Taiwan and whose outlying town had a ferry to the country. So I was shocked they thought that. Especially considering I'd just got back from taking that ferry and had a lovely time in Matsu. Passport control sure, but no one shooting us or any of the ABCs, American-born Chinese, that were doing a visa run.
Do people see the blatant contradictions between how Taiwan actually is and how the party says it is?
Obligatory, not an immigrant but am first generation born in Australia. All my relatives live in China, Hong Kong. I've never visited Hong Kong though, and often visit Shanghai to see my grandpa and uncle. Last time I went, I tried everything and it didn't work. Here's my list. Google. Surprisingly, Google Translate worked though. I had the app, YouTube, Tumblr, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, Facebook, Snapchat, Discord. I think Skype didn't work either. On WhatsApp a lot of functions didn't work. I could send messages but nothing else. Reddit, Netflix, and there's a few others I think I just didn't visit in the span of time I was there. So yeah, incredibly irritating. And the news is heavily modified to fit a picturesque view of China that makes it seem great. And annoyingly my parents are on China's side with the Hong Kong protests at the moment whilst I oppose it heavily. So much is censored there, it's insane. WeChat is such a huge app over there entirely for the reason it's one of the few that are available. Edit. Formatting changes. Edit 2. Thank you kind stranger for the silver, and also edited to add the expanding list. Edit 3. Porn sites are also banned apparently. I don't speak from direct experience but my brother told me. I didn't want to know honestly, but hey, I now do.
While this doesn't completely fall under censorship, I didn't know about the Great Leap Forward until I was a young adult. Folks in my parents' and grandparents' generations would talk about the Cultural Revolution. But no one spoke of the Great Leap Forward. My personal theory is that it was such a disaster for government planning that everyone bought into. There is a sense of loss of face, so no one wants to bring it up. Not sure what light it's painted in Chinese textbooks as I left the country as I was entering grade school. Edit. In a modern context and a much lighter note. Many of my friends who grew up in China and never went abroad know nothing about the Western meme culture. They have their own self-contained meme ecosystem, which is actually quite strong, haha. Edit 2. For everyone who is messaging me that I should have paid more attention to middle school history textbooks. 1. I prefaced my post by saying this isn't censorship and not insinuating that the Chinese government is trying to wipe history books. I just wanted to share my experience that this was never talked about, or what I see as a type of self-censorship. For comparison, I was aware of Tiananmen as it was talked about as a child. 2. If you're telling me to pay attention, please extend me the same courtesy and pay attention to the fact that I specifically said that I left China as I was entering first grade. Well before this would have been taught. In fact, I literally say, not sure what light it's painted in Chinese textbooks as I left the country as I was entering grade school.
Obligatory. I'm not a Chinese immigrant. Here's a fun little story. Though, so about 4 days ago I was on a flight from LA to Singapore with a layover at Xiamen. Long ass 9-hour layover. Problem number 1. Everything was in Chinese. Problem number 2. None of my phone's roaming was working. I tried buying a SIM card from the vending machine. Didn't work. I asked the attendant for the Wi-Fi machine. That was off and didn't work. The phone verification codes for the free Wi-Fi didn't work since I didn't have a Chinese number. I went to the SIM card store. And get this, they only sold Chinese numbers to Chinese citizens. When I tried pressing, they began making fun of me in Chinese. I think, as a last resort, I went to the first class lounge and asked them if they had working Wi-Fi. They said yes. Thank God. I paid the 250 yen. Got the password. Logged in. Fuck, nothing works. Chrome didn't load any Google searches. Discord didn't open. Instagram didn't open, so I go to the attendant with my Google search and I'm like, "Excuse me miss, the Wi-Fi doesn't work." She sees the Google search and looks at me in horror. Not sure what the exact expression said. Maybe something like, "What the fuck? Don't do that," she said to me, "No Google here," and typed in URL redacted on my phone. Loaded like a charm. That day I found out that you can't even use fucking Google in China. Well, obviously I can't live this life. So I go to the Play Store to download a VPN. Surprise! The Play Store doesn't fucking load. Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. Luckily I had a secondary iPhone with a VPN already installed. So I used that to resume my Discord glory. Fuck China honestly.
Not a lot of true immigrants in this post. But I am a genuine immigrant. First time answering Askreddit. I'm pretty excited. Hopefully my answer will not get buried in the comments. When I left China in the early 2000s, there weren't much censorship on the internet honestly. It is because the internet is still young and the CCP prob hasn't caught up with it yet. Most of the censorship is what is on the TV. The Tank Man video is censored. I first saw the video for the first time in 7th grade in America. Although it was my first time seeing the video, I immediately know what it is about because I vividly remember my family or people I knew talked about it. There wasn't a lot of hate when they were discussing it. Maybe because they didn't protest and were nowhere near BJ. Mao was always praised as the greatest leader blah blah blah. And the horrible things he has done weren't taught in the book. Though, I have seen some small-time Chinese TV shows that euphemistically criticizing what he has done. Their version of the Pledge of Allegiance says to love the party, love the country, love the people. I dang I guo I ren min. Notice how they say love the party first lol. Didn't question it when I was a kid why they put the love the party first. Or even put it in there at all. Fuck the party. Honestly, the best part of being the immigrant who speaks both languages is that it allows me to get both sides of view and allow me to hear both sides of the story. It allows me to be more unbiased. We love to say that in the US nothing is censored. Freedom of speech etc. Although things are not censored, the news are very biased. Look at Fox News. It can create such a large information gap between Americans, Dem versus Rep. Imagine what kind of gap it can create between people from two different countries. Things aren't censored in America. Sure, but things aren't mentioned either. If things aren't mentioned, then people don't even know they exist. It is sort of like softcore censorship. We have it here. The politicians do it very smartly. Sadly, once people fell in this information gap trap, it's so hard for them to get out. Look at the Donald and Sino. They are the perfect example of it. Also, people from both sides are fed with a heavy dose of patriotism when they were growing up. Same trick, same shit, different country.
Born and raised in a large city in China, immigrated here when I was 18 in 2007. I already knew about Tiananmen massacre, as my mum's cousins were among the students and my mum's ex-BF were among the soldiers when they were all young. I already heard about the organ harvesting story on the cult members. But it was some regional shit that's not the norm. I knew people who had insights about the living condition in the re-educational camp where they hold the cult members in my city. At least it wasn't too bad in my city. It sounded like somewhere between a prison and a summer camp. I already knew people in HK hated China, only because I watched Japanese TV while I was traveling in Japan with my parents. Summer 1997 when the CCP got HK back to China from UK. I already knew the CCP army surrenders in Korean War had the choice to be released to Taiwan and many of them chose so. Only because my grandfather went and fought in combats during the entire war. I was a teenager who was a rebel and felt oppressed, so I did my fair part of research. Plus I had the advantage of knowing people who participated such historical events in person. But I doubt the majorities of Chinese would care to learn as much as I did. Sometimes being ignorant and dumb is a blessing if you are stuck in a situation you can't change. What I did not know was how CCP did little to nothing during the WW2 in order to preserve power. While the Nationalist Party gave everything to defend the country, later CCP won the Civil War by brainwashing the uneducated majorities. Then twisted the whole story totally to the opposite in history textbooks and forced generations of people to believe the CCP was the legitimate ruler. The CCP even promoted for the idea of having multiple political parties to avoid tyranny and corruption. Up until they took over China and took a huge turn.
My wife, who is from China, came to the US in 2003. A Taiwanese classmate of hers asked her why the Chinese government could be so cruel during the Tiananmen Square protests. My wife argued with him and called him a liar, until she found the videos of the protests on YouTube. I still make fun of her sometimes for this. Yikes, I did the same. Arguing with a Taiwanese person about it until I realized I was wrong.
I'm also curious. Did you know about the protests but just not how bad they were? I'm curious what the commonly understood story is.
Niece try Chinese government.
Not today. CIA.
Gotta go. G.I. Joe.
Niece try. FBI.
Nice attempt at obscurity. Department of Homeland Security.
Immigrated to Canada when in high school. In social class there are 4 pages in the textbook dedicated to China, with one of them focused on Tiananmen incident. Went home and asked my dad about it. He was surprised I never heard about it somehow back in China lol. Apparently his friend was at the protest and said the situation is not as bad as how the media would have you believe. This is one of the reasons I remain skeptical on what really happened that day. Also was surprised to learn that communism is considered a bad ideology and comparable to fascism in certain context. And soon found out China is communism in name only, with a bit more research. Apparently Henry Norman Bethune is almost a nobody here but was revered greatly in China. Also learnt about how the issue of gun control gathered sizable supporters on each side. Being from China, gun ownership is a no-no, and I can see why the government wants to keep it that way. There are music videos that can be practically considered softcore porn in China. Plays on public TV channels at prime time. LGBTQ rights almost never hit mainstream media in China. I was under the impression that it is much less common than it actually is. Dalai Lama is well respected by a lot of PPL. In China he is almost unanimously considered a traitor. Edit. Mao is considered evil man. Where in China his image ranges from the savior of the country to flawed leader. Korean War is essentially China versus UN for geopolitical reasons. In most Chinese media, literature, it was referred as China versus USA for the cause of protecting the weak. Kong Mei Yuan Chao. North Korea is not just poor. It's a giant prison. Recreational drug is a thing, and you don't become a junkie and sent to rehab the moment you consume weed. Edit 2. Reading through the post I realized I am the only one that this Askreddit actually targets. I hope someone read my list lol.
Taiwan, Tiananmen, Tibet.
Forgot Winnie the Pooh. Oh bother.
The 3 teraseconds.
Since you were new, I was wondering if you had any honey. Not China, but one time I was on a flight. I think it was Qatar Airways, or one of the other Middle Eastern ones. It was a long flight, so I settled down to watch it. Do you guys remember the scene where the Jewish kid is practicing for his bar mitzvah? Entirely cut from the film. Any mention of that kid's Jewishness? Cut. Half of the gory scenes in the movie? Cut. Really surreal experience.
I'd love to see what they did with Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
I was on a Qatar flight and was settling down to watch us dead bodies were blurred. Whilst the murder scenes cut. When they said, "This has been modified to fit your screen," I didn't think half the fun of the movie would be gone.
I live in India, but I study in the UK. So I have a lot of Chinese friends who I live with. What surprised me the most is how they talked about Tibet. They talk as if it's such a nice place to visit. A great tourist destination with people who love China. It just really shook me because I have been to Tibetan refugee markets. I have seen the squalor a lot of them live in. In India, I've seen so much Tibetan sadness that I couldn't make sense of how they could say that Tibet was the prettiest place in China. In my head, Tibet is not China. Tibet is a war-torn place with its people displaced. Edit. I should clarify. I love my Chinese friends. They are my best friends. And I have plans to visit China because it's a gorgeous country with very different values. I fully respect people's views and all. And it's a very hard topic for me to talk about because what I've been taught is also very different from what I see. And I tried my best to not become emotional as I wrote what I did above. So I apologize if what I wrote offends anyone. It's only what I've seen and felt that I've written. I've also taken out the one line I realized made my statement seem more biased than it actually is because it is in the end what I've seen and heard. Not an immigrant but spent time in China. I was there in 2008 when a massive 8+ mag earthquake rocked everything near Chengdu and was felt from Shanghai to Beijing. I was in a shitblock when it hit and our shit was rocking all over the place. It was wild. Over 80,000 people died. We couldn't get on the internet or make international phone calls for nearly 4 days. They jammed everything. None of my emails to my parents went through to tell them I was okay. All my friends' phones that were unlocked for international just went dead when you tried to call anything. The internet was basically cut off everywhere we went. We eventually found an American businessman at a bar with a sat phone that could get through and he agreed to let us use the phone to call our loved ones as long as we got him a few drinks. He was chill as fuck. He was on the phone with his wife and then with his company when we approached him and begged to use his phone so we could call our people and let them know we were okay. China is an amazingly beautiful place. With great people, food, and culture, but their approach to censorship and speech is completely fucked.
Not me personally, but my neighbor was from China. Her daughter was killed in a car accident caused by someone high up in the party. The incident got completely censored.
There is a running joke that when Chinese students study abroad, they complain, everyone else knows more about China than me.
Taiwan number 1.
China number 4.
Reverse answer actually. I was surprised at the number of people who didn't know about Japan's war crimes during WW2. The older generations are still bitter about it.
To be fair, it was absolutely horrific what Japan did to the Chinese.
Another guy here, not born in China, but both of my parents are Chinese. Just wanted to give some perspective about how the government can easily shape the minds of their people. I was born in America, and although my brother was born in China, he spent most of his life here too. As a result, we're both relatively liberal and not blind to a lot of the bullshit that China pulls. Anyways, while doing a project for my 9th grade history class on China in the 1900s, I decided to have a bit of fun by putting some whiskers and cat ears on Map Zedong and dub him, Meow Zedong, for an image in my slideshow. I like to make people laugh a bit, so I thought it was a funny thing I could just slip into my assignment. Somehow, my father caught wind of what I was doing in my project. And he immediately came to me and berated me on what I had done. He told me that I shouldn't tarnish Mao's name or image. And it was essentially a sin and I would be cursed with misfortune for the rest of my life. The worst part was my father didn't even seem that angry at me, he seemed almost frightened. Since then, my family has become slightly more informed and disillusioned to the schemes of the Chinese government and have taken a more neutral and open-minded stance to their affairs. Which I am extremely happy about. As much as I appreciate China for its rich history, culture, and people, its government is nothing short of despicable, and the amount of control they have over their own people, as well as American companies that they shouldn't have in the first place, is despicable and honestly downright scary. Number 5 demands not one less.
I actually knew about a lot of stuff before I traveled to Australia. Since there was a period before 2008 when everything was accessible. Like YouTube and Twitter and stuff. I remember I was crushed watching the Tiananmen Square massacre documentary. It was an earth-shattering type thing. Like finding out about a much uglier alternative reality that I actually live in. But I never knew if the organ harvesting thing is legit or not. And I never bothered to check simply because finding out doesn't change anything really. Every time I come back to China it's frustrating as hell, but you get used to it since there are Chinese equivalents of everything.
That one episode of Pokemon.
The boobs one or the gun one. Edit. Or the seizure one.
In thinking seizure one. Which are the other two?
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to support the channel, and above all, have an excellent day you marvelous people.